Welcome back, and welcome back to this wonderful book, the book of Hebrews. As I read through this, I reflect on it, and oftentimes we see people in a backslidden state. They've turned away from the Lord. They're no longer walking with the Lord, even though at some point in their lives they might have been fervent believers. And what happens to most people is that they don't really turn against the Lord. They don't think about it and say, "Oh, I don't believe this anymore." They just neglect the Lord. They just drift away. And that's what we see here in chapter 2 is this warning about not drifting. Don't drift away. Remember, we're in this section that's talking about the Christ is better, the overall book. And then these first 4 chapters is Christ is better in his person. And this section opens up about the danger of drifting. In verse 1, he warns them about drifting away. In verse 3, he talks about neglect. This is a warning here to stay fervent, to stay on fire for the Lord. He's telling them in these first 4 verses that they really have no excuse. They have been a witness to the apostolic preaching. These readers, these listeners, if this is a sermon, have been witnesses to signs and wonders. So they have really no excuse to drift away. How much more us, brothers and sisters, with the fullness of revelation that we have, more revelation than people that were even listening to the Apostle Paul, if that's what this is, a sermon from him, that we have so much more revelation that we have no excuse at all. The only thing that's left for people with no excuse, if they drift away and if they neglect pursuing the Lord, is a just retribution. That's what these verses tell us. I think, as I said at the outset, I don't think he's talking about losing your salvation here. I think he's talking about being chastised by the Lord. When we get to chapter 12 of Hebrews, he'll talk about the chastisement that comes from God on his children. Just as a human father chastises his human children, so the Lord chastises us from a rebuke from his word to scourging. It says in Hebrews 12:5. So that's what we have here is a warning against drifting away, and a warning that if we do that, the only thing that we have to look forward to is a just retribution from God. We have no excuse, it says in verses 5 through 9, because God has revealed the glory that Jesus will have. That he's told us not only about Christ, but the glory that Christ is going to have in the future. That we have a hope, not just for today, but a hope for the future as well. Verses 10 through 13, we're not to drift away because Jesus is sanctifying the church just as he was sanctified. And how was that? He was sanctified through suffering. He was set apart. He learned obedience, as weird a concept that is, that Christ would learn something, but he would experience what it's like to be obedience in the face of suffering. And that is what's happening in the church. That was happening in the first century. That's happening today. That suffering proves the church. Suffering trains us. And that's what's happening to this church. So we're not to drift away, not to neglect the Lord because we may be suffering. And I know in my case, and perhaps in yours as well, we don't really suffer. We're not suffering the loss of property. We're not suffering the loss of livelihood. Not suffering the loss of our health because of torture or beating. Mostly, brothers and sisters, I think we find ourselves inconvenienced. So how much more, how much less of an excuse do we have to drift away from the Lord just because we're inconvenienced? Those inconveniences, those light sufferings, those maybe light afflictions we'd call them, are the Lord training us. And then because Jesus faced and freed us from the fear of death, so we don't have to fear death at all, brothers and sisters. There's a great movement in our culture, great movement in our society right now to put the fear of death in everyone in order to make us comply. And that's always been Satan's strategy, is to cause people to fear death in order that he might enslave them. And we see that happening today, and we know that we don't have to do that because Jesus has faced death, he's overcome death, and he promises that we will overcome death as well. And then finally, Jesus, who suffered temptation, was equipped by that to help us who are being tempted to endure the suffering of temptation. So I think, again, in the context of Hebrews, the temptation for them is to drift back into Judaism, to drift back into the practices of Moses and the law. And Paul is telling them, the writer of Hebrews is telling them, don't do it. Christ is better. If you slip back and you're a true believer, the only thing you have to look forward to is retribution from God. He's going to chastise you. But Christ is available. He's here to help you. He knows how to help you because he knows how to suffer at the hands of the Jewish leaders, just as these readers are. So what do we learn from this? How do we bridge that gap from the first century to today? Well, for one thing is, let's not drift. Let's not neglect the great salvation that we have through Christ. Let's redouble our efforts. Let's today resolve to spend more time in the Word, more time in prayer, to be more consistent with our service in our church or our service within our Christian community, whatever that might be. And let's sign up to suffer. Let's embrace the suffering that's come into our life, knowing that Christ has suffered, knowing that Christ himself has suffered before us and set a pattern that we're to follow, knowing that through suffering, we are being made holy. We are being made more and more like Jesus. I know that's not a popular message. I know that it's not something you'd hear from prosperity teachers, but let's suffer and suffer well, whether that suffering is because of our faith or because of failing health or because of an injury. Let's suffer as people who have faith in Christ, who suffered for us. God bless you, brothers and sisters. Continue in your reading in Hebrews. Again, I find it a really interesting and exciting and edifying book, and I hope you find it edifying and encouraging as well. God bless you.